In the winter of 2003, inside a commercial truck repair bay just outside Mississauga, Ontario, a mechanic rolled out a massive, bruised, slate-gray steel cabinet. Its drawers were heavy, its paint was chipped, revealing thick, cold-rolled steel beneath the worn surface. It bore a simple stamped badge, Gray Tools. Beside it sat three newer, bright red toolboxes bought at a national hardware chain for a fraction of the price. The cheap imported boxes were only 2 years old, and their drawer slides were already warping under the weight of half-inch sockets. The gray box was 35 years old, and its steel tracks pulled out as smoothly as the day it left the factory floor. That same year, a few miles away in Brampton, the Gray Tools plant was still running. The heavy drop hammers were still falling. The company was still forging steel. They were still honoring a lifetime warranty, and they were still proudly operating as the last industrial hand tool manufacturer in Canada. They had not gone bankrupt. They had not fled offshore. They had survived. Yet the heavy steel toolboxes that once defined the physical architecture of every serious Canadian garage were disappearing from retail shelves, quietly phased out by an economic reality that punished longevity. The market had decided that a box built to outlast the mechanic was simply too expensive to sell. A decade earlier, the heavy gauge of Canadian steel was the only standard a trade school would accept. Now it was a luxury the aisle could not support. But the real story of Gray Tools in Canada is not about a company that collapsed. It is the story of a toolmaker that survived by retreating from the consumer market and what it cost the Canadian mechanic when retail channels decided that cheap replacement was better than heavy endurance. Canada built the garage, the forest built the demand, the market wrote the rules. We tell the stories of what happened when those forces collided. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing them. The story begins not in an overseas mega factory, but in Canada, in the industrial heart of Toronto in 1912. In 1912, the city of Toronto was an industrial engine operating at the edge of a vast, unforgiving geography. The railways were expanding westward. The first large-scale automotive plants were beginning to assemble cars in Oshawa and Windsor. The Canadian economy was transitioning from timber and agriculture to heavy manufacturing, and every new machine required constant, precise maintenance. But the mechanics, the machinists, and the factory workers building this new infrastructure faced a crippling geographic reality. If a worker needed a reliable wrench, a hand tool used to grip and turn a nut, bolt, or fitting, he could not buy a professional-grade version manufactured in his own country. Before Alex Gray established his business, the Canadian tool market was defined entirely by absence. A machine shop in Hamilton or a railway maintenance yard in Montreal had to rely on heavy, expensive imports from the storied steel towns of Sheffield, England, or from the massive drop forging plants of Ohio and Pennsylvania. In a local hardware store, a mechanic might find crude cast iron farm wrenches cast by local foundries. But these were brittle. They snapped under heavy torque. For precision work on the new internal combustion engines, Canadian workers depended on foreign supply lines. When a tool broke during a Canadian winter, the cost was not just the price of replacement, it was the cost of time. A shattered socket, a removable metal cup that fits over a fastener and connects to a turning handle, meant a tractor sat idle in Saskatchewan for 3 weeks, while a replacement shipped by rail from Chicago. The Canadian worker possessed the skill, the demand, and the industry, but lacked the domestic steel to guarantee his own work. Alex Gray, a young Torontonian with a background in hardware sales, recognized this vacuum. He did not start as a blacksmith. He started as a pragmatist. In 1912, he founded A. Gray & Company in Toronto, initially acting as a distributor. He traveled the muddy roads of early 20th century Canada, selling specialized tools out of the trunk of his car to mechanics who were desperate for reliable equipment. He learned exactly what failed, where it failed, and why it failed. By the 1920s, the automotive boom changed the equation. Supplying foreign tools was no longer enough. To control quality, inventory, and cost, Gray realized the tools had to be made on Canadian soil. The company entered a partnership to become Gray Bonney Tool Company, securing the technology to bring mass professional tool production to Ontario. They introduced drop forging to their production line, a manufacturing process where a massive mechanical hammer drives heated metal into a shaped die, forcing the steel grain to follow the contours of the tool for immense strength. This was the exact moment the Canadian tool market shifted. The domestic mechanic no longer had to choose between a fragile local casting and an expensive American import. The entry into the Canadian market was methodical and focused squarely on the professional trades. Records suggest that in the late 1920s, an early Canadian-made gray open-end wrench, a wrench with a U-shaped opening that slides onto two sides of a fastener, sold for roughly $60. In today's money, that is approximately $10. It was not the cheapest tool on the market, but it was priced aggressively against imported equivalents. In an era where a mechanic's weekly wage might be just $25, an investment in a gray wrench was a calculated decision to buy a tool that would not round off a crucial bolt. The early reception established the brand's reputation immediately. Regional automotive supply houses, rather than just general hardware stores, became the primary distributors. Companies like Bowman Brothers, a major automotive parts distributor in Western Canada, began stocking Gray Bonnie tools to supply the growing network of prairie service stations. This placement was deliberate. By putting the tools directly in the hands of professional parts suppliers, Gray bypassed the casual consumer and went straight to the workers who turn wrenches for a living. By 1928, Canadian automotive trade journals began taking note of the domestic alternative, highlighting the quality of the Toronto-made steel. The trade press of the period indicates that mechanics valued the precise machining of the jaw openings, the exact tolerance that helped a tool fit a fastener accurately without slipping and tearing the mechanic's knuckles against an engine block. Within a decade of beginning domestic manufacturing, industry estimates suggest the company had expanded its catalog from a handful of basic automotive wrenches to hundreds of specialized tools supported by a network of dozens of regional industrial supply counters across Ontario, Quebec, and the expanding West. They had built the steel. They had built the distribution. They had proven that a Canadian factory could produce a tool equal to anything forged in Chicago or Sheffield. But to truly conquer the Canadian garage, Gray needed to offer something more than just individual wrenches. They needed to provide the entire architecture of the mechanic's working life. The tool that cemented the company's dominance in Canada was not a single piece of forged steel, it was an entire system. By the mid-20th century, as the company evolved into Gray Tools and eventually moved its operations to a sprawling facility in Brampton, Ontario, it recognized that a professional mechanic did not just need a wrench, he needed a fortress. The breakthrough that defined the brand for a generation of Canadian tradesmen was the Gray Professional Mechanics Toolbox, loaded with their precision-forged combination wrenches. To understand why this mattered, one must understand how a mechanic interacted with his equipment. A combination wrench, a hand tool with an open end on one side and a box end on the other, used to grip a fastener from multiple angles, was the extension of the worker's own hand. But the toolbox was his resume. In a busy Toronto service bay or a crowded Edmonton fleet garage, a mechanic did not use the shop's tools. He brought his own. His livelihood depended entirely on the organization, security, and durability of the steel cabinet he rolled up to the bumper. A Canadian worker approaching a Gray toolbox in 1955 encountered a piece of industrial architecture. It was constructed from cold-rolled steel, sheet metal that is flattened and shaped at room temperature to increase its structural strength and create a perfectly smooth finish. Where cheap consumer-grade boxes use thin metal folded over itself, the Gray boxes utilized heavy-gauge steel secured by dense spot welding, a process where two pieces of metal are permanently fused by applying immense electrical current and pressure at discrete points. When a mechanic pulled open a loaded drawer, the difference was visceral. A drawer filled with 60 pounds of sockets, ratchets, and heavy hammers did not sag. It did not bind. The friction slides, heavily greased and precisely aligned, pulled out with a steady, deliberate glide. The box felt as permanent as the concrete floor it rested on. Inside that box lay rows of Gray wrenches, heavily plated in chrome. A thin metal coating applied electrochemically to resist the corrosive salt and moisture of Canadian winters while creating a polished finish that could be wiped clean of motor oil with a single rag. This level of engineering required a serious financial commitment. In 1952, a heavy-duty Gray mechanic's chest and roller cabinet base, without a single tool inside, could cost an apprentice roughly $65. In today's money, that is approaching $750. Fully loaded with gray ratchets, sockets, and wrenches, the investment could represent several months' wages. By contrast, a flimsy stamped steel box from a local hardware catalog might cost a third of that price. But Canadian mechanics understood the mathematics of failure. A cheap toolbox would buckle under the weight of industrial tools. Its drawers would jam, refusing to open when a mechanic was halfway through a transmission rebuild and desperately needed a half-inch socket. The lost time cost more than the steel. The distribution breakthrough that pushed gray tools from a respected local manufacturer to a national standard was not a consumer retail campaign. It was military and institutional adoption. During the Second World War, the Canadian government needed millions of tools that would not shatter in the cold of a European winter or the damp of a naval shipyard. Gray Bonnie provided massive quantities of wrenches and specialized tools for the war effort. When the war ended, thousands of Canadian mechanics returned home having already trusted their lives to those specific tools. The brand did not need to introduce itself to the post-war automotive boom. It was already in the hands of the men building it. Following this momentum, the tools entered the absolute core of the Canadian professional ecosystem. The Royal Canadian Electrical and Mechanical Engineers had relied on them overseas. Back home, heavy-duty mechanics at the massive General Motors assembly plant in Oshawa standardized their carts with gray steel. CN Rail maintenance yards in Winnipeg stocked them in their locomotive bays. Instructors at the Ryerson Institute of Technology in Toronto recommended them as the baseline standard for new apprentices entering the automotive trades. Industrial supply giants like Acklands pushed gray products across the prairies, ensuring that an oilfield service truck in Calgary had the exact same reliable gear as a factory maintenance crew in Hamilton. What competitors could not replicate was the Canadian moat that Gray had built. It was a physical and geographical advantage. If an American brand's wrench snapped or its toolbox track bent, a Canadian mechanic faced a nightmare of cross-border shipping, customs delays, and distant customer service. With Gray, the warranty, the maker's formal promise to replace or repair a tool if it fails under specified use, was backed by a factory just down the highway in Brampton. A broken tool handed to a regional distributor on a Tuesday could be replaced by a new one off the domestic manufacturing line by Thursday. They possessed the ideal alloy steel, the heavy drop forging dies, and the heavy gauge sheet metal presses, all operating within the borders of the market they serve. The mechanic, the machinist, and the millwright all depended on the same stamped steel. For the men turning bolts in the freezing drafts of Canadian garages, the name stamped into the handle was not a country of origin. It was a specification. By the late 1960s, the Canadian industrial landscape was operating at maximum capacity. The Trans-Canada Highway was complete. Automotive plants in southern Ontario were churning out vehicles under the Autopact Agreement. Resource extraction in the north demanded heavy machinery that ran continuously in brutal conditions. In this environment of relentless mechanical wear, Gray tools achieved a level of market saturation that transcended mere commercial success. The brand became an institutional reflex. The Canadian professional ecosystem adopted the Brampton-made tools and heavy-gauge storage cabinets as the undisputed national standard. Mechanics at the Toronto Transit Commission repair bays maintained city buses using gray sockets. Heavy-duty fitters deep inside the Inco nickel mines in Sudbury relied on gray striking wrenches to loosen massive industrial fasteners. Instructors at Centennial College in Toronto and the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology in Calgary mandated gray sets for their incoming apprentices. Independent hardware institutions, like Aikenhead's Hardware, proudly displayed the tool lines on their professional counters. Maintenance departments at the Ford Assembly plant in Windsor stocked their tool cribs with gray steel. Across the country, the mechanic, the machinist, and the millwright all depended on the same stamped steel. The tools were not just available, they were woven into the very fabric of Canadian trade education and industrial procurement. The cultural moment that defined the brand's peak was the golden age of the independent Canadian service station. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, before computerized diagnostics reduced automotive repair to software updates, a mechanic diagnosed engines by sound, touch, and mechanical intuition. The physical garage was his domain. And the centerpiece of that domain was the rolling tool cabinet. Owning a massive stacked gray toolbox, usually painted a brilliant industrial red or a deep, serious gray, was not merely a matter of storage. It was a visual declaration of professional competence. When a customer walked into a service bay in winter, they saw the frozen slush melting off the concrete floor. They smelled the exhaust, and they saw the towering steel box. It signaled that the man turning the wrenches had invested heavily in his trade. The box organized the chaos. It held the torque wrenches, precision hand tools that measure and limit twisting force so a fastener is tightened to an exact specified value without snapping. It held the diagonal cutters, heavy pliers with angled cutting jaws used to shear thick wire. Every drawer had a purpose. Every socket had a place. Every tool was within arm's reach. This level of organization and reliability was not a luxury in the Canadian climate. It was absolute necessity. On a frozen suspension bolt inside a remote Alberta oilfield service bay, where a cheap jaw would round the flats and turn 10 minutes into an hour, the wrench's grip could mean the difference between finishing the repair and losing the rig for the day. Canadian mechanics demanded a tool that could absorb the torque, bite into the steel, and turn the fastener without failing. Gray delivered. The response from the trades was absolute loyalty. Apprentices saved their wages for months to buy their first Gray starter set. Retiring mechanics passed their heavily worn, oil-stained toolboxes down to their sons. The brand achieved a mythic status within the trade, supported by a domestic warranty network that meant a mechanic never had to wait for a shipping container from overseas to replace a broken drive handle. The Brampton factory operated at full tilt to meet this demand, pouring out specialized tools for aviation, heavy trucking, forestry, and rail. They forged the blanks. They machined the tolerances. They stamped the name. At its peak, a gray toolbox sitting in a Canadian factory under fluorescent shop light was a physical monument to domestic engineering. The heavy-gauge sheet metal absorbed the relentless vibrations of the shop floor. The chrome plating, a thin metal coating used to resist corrosion and create a polished finish, caught the blue flashes of welding arcs and the harsh glare of overhead drop lights. When a worker reached into a drawer and picked up a heavily knurled gray ratchet, a handle with a one-way mechanism that turns a socket without removing it from the fastener each time, featuring a textured pattern cut into the metal to improve grip, the tool felt perfectly balanced. It was immune to the freezing temperatures of a January farm shop. It was impervious to the corrosive chemicals of a fleet maintenance yard. The worn steel, where a thumb had polished the brand name smooth over thousands of turns, told the story of a tool that belonged exactly where it was. By 1978, the scale of the Brampton operation was massive. Industry estimates of the period indicate that the facility was producing millions of individual hand tools annually. The brand was carried by an estimated 5,400 industrial distributors, professional tool jobbers, and regional hardware outlets from coast to coast. They owned the heavy industrial sector. A mechanic walking into an Acklands branch in Saskatoon, an automotive supplier in Halifax, or an industrial parts desk in Montreal did not have to special order gray steel. It was already there, stacked on the shelves waiting to be put to work. Every drawer, every bench, every repair. The service network was the invisible architecture supporting this empire. If a heavy-duty mechanic somehow managed to crack a socket under extreme leverage, he simply handed it across the counter to his local authorized dealer. The dealer handed him a brand new one from the shelf. No complex paperwork, no cross-border shipping delays, no waiting. The Brampton plant absorbed the replacement because the steel rarely failed. This warranty, the maker's promise to replace or repair a tool if it fails under specified use, was not a marketing tactic. It was the absolute bedrock of mechanical trust in Canada. But this physical dominance disguised a growing structural vulnerability. Gray Tools had built its empire on three pillars: heavy Canadian steel, domestic manufacturing labor, and an unconditional lifetime replacement guarantee. In 1975, those pillars represented quality. They represented trust. They represented endurance. But they also represented immense unavoidable cost. The storage cabinets, in particular, were logistical heavyweights. Shipping a 150-pound empty steel roller cabinet from the Brampton loading docks by rail and truck to a dealer in Vancouver was a highly expensive proposition. The final purchase price of the box reflected the quality of the friction tracks, the thickness of the cold-rolled steel, the wages of the Ontario welders, and the sheer geography of Canada itself. For decades, the professional mechanic willingly paid that premium because there was no viable alternative that could survive the daily abuse of the trade. In the late 1970s, Gray Tools stood at the absolute summit of the Canadian hand tool market. Their wrenches turned the bolts on pipelines. Their sockets assembled the cars. Their heavy steel boxes anchored the garages. The brand had achieved the rarest of industrial feats. It had become entirely synonymous with the work itself. But the market was preparing to ask a critical question. It was a question about retail, about globalization, and about price, and it was a question that would tear the Canadian hand tool industry apart. The Canadian turning point arrived not with a catastrophic failure of engineering, but with a fundamental shift in retail mathematics. By the early 1990s, the economic ecosystem that had supported domestic heavy manufacturing began to fracture. The decline of the Canadian heavy tool market and the eventual disappearance of the domestic toolbox from public view was driven by two intersecting structural shifts. Force 5, steel, labor, warranty, and distribution costs, and Force 3, competition from cheap imports and private labels. For decades, the high price of a gray toolbox was justified by its working environment. A professional mechanic operating in a commercial repair bay required heavy-gauge cold-rolled steel. But the hardware market of the 1990s was expanding rapidly into the suburbs. The weekend garage warrior, the casual DIY enthusiast, and the home mechanic suddenly became the most lucrative consumer demographic in the country. This new consumer did not need a cabinet capable of surviving a commercial truck bay or an industrial mining operation. They simply needed an affordable place to store their sockets. Enter the private label, a product manufactured by one company, often overseas, and sold under a different retailer's brand name. National hardware giants recognized that they could bypass North American factories entirely. Retailers like Canadian Tire, rapidly expanding their Mastercraft lines, began sourcing stamped steel toolboxes from massive manufacturing facilities in Taiwan and eventually mainland China. In these overseas plants, the labor costs were a fraction of the union wages paid in Ontario. The physical differences were immediately apparent to an experienced tradesman. The imported boxes used thinner sheet metal. They relied on single-wall construction instead of reinforced double-wall bracing. Their casters were smaller and their drawer tracks were lighter. Many introduced ball-bearing drawer slides, a mechanism using small steel balls rolling in a track to allow drawers to open smoothly, which felt impressive on the showroom floor, but often lacked the heavy load capacity of the older, greased friction slides used in industrial boxes. But to the casual buyer standing in a retail aisle, a glossy red steel box looked like a glossy red steel box. The price disparity was absolute. A professional Canadian-made roller cabinet forged in Brampton might retail for over $800 in 1992, roughly $1,500 today. An imported private label equivalent, painted in the same high-gloss enamel and occupying the exact same amount of floor space, could be purchased for $250. The domestic and foreign brands alike were squeezed by a market where casual buyers chose price first. The low-cost tool did not need to be better. It only needed to be good enough for the buyer standing in the aisle. This retail shift weaponized Force 5 against the Canadian manufacturer. Gray Tools manufactured in Brampton. They paid local wages. They purchased high-grade North American steel. They maintained a lifetime warranty network staffed by Canadian workers, and most importantly, they had to ship dead weight. Transporting an empty 200-pound steel roller cabinet by truck from a loading dock in Ontario to a hardware distributor in British Columbia incurred massive domestic freight costs. Conversely, the imported boxes arrived tightly packed in standardized ocean shipping containers at the Port of Vancouver. The overseas logistics deeply undercut domestic freight mathematics before the product even reached a Western Canadian warehouse. Faced with this impossible arithmetic, the Canadian retail channels made their choice. Independent hardware stores, long the primary bastion of professional tools, were being aggressively crushed by big box consolidation. The massive new retail chains demanded higher profit margins, lower wholesale costs, and aggressive promotional pricing. They began pulling the expensive, heavy domestic boxes off their showroom floors, replacing them with stacks of imported private label cartons. A company cannot forge heavy steel at a loss. Gray Tools recognized that the mass consumer market was permanently lost to offshore pricing. Rather than cheapen their steel, thin their sheet metal, or degrade their forgings to compete with discount imports, the company made a strategic retreat. Throughout the 1990s, they began to quietly withdraw their heavy storage cabinets and hand tool displays from general consumer hardware shelves. The brand stepped back from the weekend garage and entrenched itself entirely within the industrial and heavy professional sectors. They doubled down on their contracts with the military, the national railways, the northern resource extraction companies, and specialized industrial supply houses like Ackland's Granger. Gray Tools is the rare protagonist in Canadian tool history that refused to die. While the consumer hardware market collapsed around them, and their iconic heavy-gauge steel toolboxes vanished from retail aisles, the company itself entrenched in Brampton. The brand name was not sold to a foreign conglomerate. Some tool names did not survive the Canadian market. Beach Industries fell. Other historic brands outsourced their production entirely to survive. But Gray resurrected its own future by making the hardest choice an industrial empire can make. It amputated its most visible consumer symbol to save its engineering soul. By retreating from the retail aisles, Gray Tools avoided the slow, humiliating death of brand dilution. They did not outsource the Gray name to a cheap overseas stamping plant just to keep selling glossy red toolboxes in big box stores. They did not compromise the steel. They did not dilute the brand. They did not chase the consumer shelf. The toolbox line died in the consumer market so the toolmaker could live in the industrial sector. Gray Tools remains Canadian-owned, still forging industrial hand tools for the heavy trades. But the heavy steel boxes, the rolling red and gray fortresses that once defined the Canadian service station, became ghosts of a closed era. Today, an intense secondary market exists across Canada, specifically for these surviving vintage gray toolboxes. In online classifieds from Kijiji in Ontario to machinist forums in British Columbia, at rural estate sales in Saskatchewan, and in auto swap meets outside Toronto, these heavy steel cabinets are actively hunted by a dedicated community. Tool collectors, industrial historians, retired factory workers, and young professional mechanics search relentlessly for the old Brampton steel. Young apprentices, frustrated by the disposable nature of modern retail offerings, actively hunt for estate sales in Hamilton or Windsor, hoping to pull a forgotten gray chest from a retired auto worker's basement. They spend weekends grinding away the surface rust, repainting the heavy sheet metal, and re-greasing the heavy drawer tracks. A heavily worn 50-year-old gray roller cabinet, its paint faded and its top deeply scarred by decades of motor oil and dropped wrenches, will often sell for more on the used market today than a brand new imported box. Buyers willingly pay hundreds of dollars for these rusted monuments. They do not buy them for nostalgia. They buy them because the original cannot be replaced by modern consumer production for certain tasks. A heavy-duty mechanic working on diesel machinery in northern Alberta relies on massive 3/4-inch drive sockets that weigh several pounds each. When placed in the drawer of a modern, cheaply stamped imported box, the thin metal floor buckles and the ball-bearing slides jam under the sheer gravitational load. An old gray box from 1975, constructed with thick, cold-rolled steel and heavy grease friction tracks, simply absorbs the weight. The drawer pulls open effortlessly. Furthermore, when a mechanic leans his entire body weight against the top of an old gray cabinet while muscling a seized alternator bracket, the box does not sway, it does not twist. The heavy-gauge sheet metal provides an unyielding foundation. A modern private label box twists and groans under the same torsional stress, eventually warping its frame until the drawers refuse to close. The original gray cabinet matters because Canadian tradesmen still encounter jobs that require absolute structural rigidity. Not for sentimentality, because the job still begins where heavy steel meets heavy steel. The physical site of this legacy still exists, functioning as a defiance of modern industrial trends. At 2999 Orenda Road in Brampton, Ontario, the Gray Tools manufacturing facility still operates. It stands surrounded by a modern industrial landscape that has largely shifted away from heavy manufacturing toward warehousing, logistics, and distribution centers for imported goods. The heavy drop hammers inside the Gray plant still fall, shaking the concrete floors as they forge wrenches and sockets for pipelines and railways. But the massive sheet metal presses and the assembly lines that once folded and welded the iconic heavy toolboxes are gone. The space they occupied has been adapted to the realities of a modern, specialized industrial toolmaker. The factory is a survivor, but the physical architecture of the mechanic's box that it once built has been left to the past. There is a surprise footnote to the story of the Gray Toolbox in Canada. While the company ceased producing the heavy consumer steel cabinets decades ago, the lifetime warranty on the forged hand tools that populated them remained absolute. Today, if a mechanic finds a deeply rusted, 50-year-old Gray combination wrench inside a battered vintage toolbox at a farm auction in Manitoba and somehow manages to break it under extreme torque, the modern factory in Brampton will still honor the replacement. The company outlived the boxes, but it never abandoned the tools inside them. The story of the Gray Toolbox in Canada reveals exactly how the domestic commercial culture absorbs and discards manufacturing excellence. It highlights the devastating gap between what workers say they value, craftsmanship, extreme reliability, and lifetime use, and what the modern retail market actually rewards: mass volume, cheap outsourcing, and immediate availability. Gray Tools proved that a Canadian factory could build a storage system capable of lasting a century, but the retail ecosystem proved that the mass consumer would rather buy a cheap box 3 times than pay for a perfect box once. What was lost when those heavy steel boxes disappeared from the hardware aisles was not just sheet metal. It was a culture of permanence, replaced entirely by an economy of replacement. Yet far from the corporate retail shelves and the imported logistics hubs, the original steel endures. Somewhere deep inside a drafty, unheated farm shop in rural Saskatchewan, as the winter wind rattles the tin roof, a heavily dented, oil-stained, slate-gray toolbox sits against a concrete wall. Its track still smooth, its spot welds still unbroken, and its heavy steel drawers still holding the weight of a working life, still waiting for a mechanic's hand and one more repair. See you in the next one.